All right, hello and welcome to another episode of A Fresh Perspective with Jeff Charles, with your favorite conservatarian contrarian, Jeff Charles, where we prefer truth over narrative and principles over politics. And I've got another fire guest for you today. This is going to be awesome, maybe a little depressing, but it's stuff that we need to know. I mean, and it's stuff that, and it's serious, especially with the ongoing debate over education. This next guest is going to bring a lot of insight and knowledge. But before we get into everything, you know what to do. You got to like this video. You got to share this video. You got to subscribe if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button right now. I'm watching you. Are you hitting that subscribe? Hit that subscribe button. Hit that notification bell. That way you will be notified whenever I upload a new interview, which I do every Wednesday and Friday evening at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard. Also, if you want to support my work monetarily, all of those links are in the show notes. So you've got the CashApp, Venmo app, all the apps. I appreciate it all. And you've got to remember that LibertyNation.com is a proud sponsor of A Fresh Perspective. Check out LibertyNation.com for all of your conservatarian news, original articles and analysis, videos, podcasts, Liberty Nation Radio, and their signature TV program, The Conservative Five, all on LibertyNation.com, where truth is making a comeback. All right, hold on, I got to grab my charger real quick. Now, without further ado, I have my guest. She is William E. Simon Fellow at Manhattan Institute, Kay Hymowitz. How are you doing?
Hey, Jeff.
Good to have you. Good to have you here. Now, you wrote this article. It's not out yet, but it's going to be out for City Journal, and it blew my mind, and it's going to blow everybody else's mind when it comes out, because I'm going to be highlighting it quite frequently. But before we get into all of that stuff, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you and what do you do?
So I'm a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, as you say, and most of what I do is writing for City Journal, which is their publication, their quarterly publication. And we have a website, and then there are a lot of articles put up daily on that website. I recommend it to the audience, full of all kinds of interesting experts and findings and good writers. So I have been studying for many years now the breakdown of the family and its influence on poverty and inequality, because that seems to me something that's left out of the inequality discussion quite a bit. Yes. And it started with an interest in children and how they were faring. And I also, in that vein, was interested in education. Mm-hmm. And I began to notice that my youngest child was not reading as we were getting to third grade. And that set me on, and my other two children had read okay, but she did not. And as I started to look into the research for what leads to competent reading, I realized she wasn't getting that at all. And in fact, the school told me, as they told many parents in that class, that the child needed summer tutoring. And the tutoring involves something so basic that I thought, well, why aren't they teaching that in school? So anyway, that was years ago, and I got interested in that. And then more recently, with the CRT debates, the social justice debates, the questions of what we should be teaching in school, I've come back a little bit to education as an interest.
Okay. Now, the article is titled How Really to Be an Antiracist. Now, that's a play on Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, who is the king of accusing everybody of not being anti-racist enough. So I appreciate that headline just right off the bat, because a lot of the people who claim to be about being anti-racist are everything that they claim to hate. So what first? I mean, I know you got into education, all that. You told me the story about that. What made you write this particular article?
Well, I think it's common sense. I mean, I thought to myself, how is it that these kids are supposed to understand this stuff when they are not doing so well in basics? And then I started to look specifically at reading scores and reading performance among different groups, especially Black children. And I thought, wait a minute, there's a disconnect here. If we're really, really worried about the performance of Black children in school, the first thing we ought to be doing is teaching them reading successfully. I always found it ironic that Ibram Kendi defines anything as racist that is an anti-racist. And I thought, well, has he looked recently at the curriculum in the school? Because the reading curriculum that most schools or many schools use could easily be described as racist. From his vantage point, I wouldn't put it that way, but so because it means so much failure on the part of so many kids, and particularly disadvantaged kids who don't have the benefit of parents in the home with who are reading to them a lot, who have a lot of books in the house, a lot of more complex vocabulary, and that kind of thing, all of which helps in reading performance. But there's some very basic things that can be done to improve the outcomes of these kids. Now, let me give you some numbers so we know what we're talking about here. Now, the fact is that we're not doing a very good job of teaching reading to anybody. It isn't just Black kids. So about 35 kids, this is according to the National Association of Education Progress, which is known as the nation's report card. About 35% of fourth graders are proficient. That's 35%, which means way below, and that's
a little over a third.
Yeah. And about 65% are not, meaning, yeah. So, and then even worse, and these are 2019 numbers, by the way, even worse is about 34% are below basic. Now, let me explain. NAEP uses 3 different categories.
Okay.
Advanced, proficient, and basic. And then there are kids who don't even reach basic. And the basic is just sort of a basic understanding of the words or awareness of the words, but really no proficiency. So that means that we've got a huge number of kids who are below basic. Now, let me just give you some. I'm looking at the numbers here because I'd never be able to remember all of these.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. So for Black children, the number of below basic reason, or the percentage of below basic, that is, they haven't even reached a basic level, is 52% in fourth grade. All right, that's over half Black children are not reading at even a basic.
That number particularly hit me when I saw that. I was like, I think I knew it was bad, but when you see the numbers,
yeah, it is astounding. Yeah. And a crisis, really, and many people do know this. Some experts, though they're not listened to very much on the topic, and we need a lot more attention to it. Just to pinpoint a couple of other data points that I think are revealing. In cities like Baltimore and Detroit, some of the more heavily Black cities, it's so low, the number of kids who are reading at proficiency, that it's like close to zero.
Yes, negligible.
Yeah, so Baltimore has 61% of its Black kids, and about 80% of the population, the school population, is Black. About 61% is below basic. In Baltimore, in Detroit, and Cleveland, it's even a touch lower. And in other words, these kids just they're not reading. They're in their sometimes often graduating. I tell the story of one young man who graduated from Detroit high school. I don't have the name of the school, with honors. With honors, he goes on to community college, and he can't pass, and he's in tutoring. And he thought, well, how could I have been an honor student? Well, the answer is there are passing people, who try, I suppose, or who, for other reasons, they want to give encouragement to, but who they haven't taught to read. And there he is in community college with having to go backwards, basically, to learn to read.
That story blew my mind. It made me sad and infuriated at the same time. He graduated top of his class with honors and couldn't make it in a community college.
Right.
It would be one thing if he got into that community college and he just wasn't working, or he just was being lazy. But he wasn't at the level of proficiency. And then hearing you explain what below basic means, I didn't understand that from the article. I didn't understand that term, but I mean, there's below proficiency and then below basic.
Right.
61% of Black students in the city of Baltimore. That is obscene.
Yeah.
So
it is.
So what's going on here? Like, how did this happen, Kay? Like, how? I mean, I'm sure there are a lot of different factors.
Right.
But what would you say are some of the most pernicious here?
Well, look, poorer students always are having, I should say, on average, poor students do worse in school. And that includes reading. For some of the reasons that I just mentioned, they just are not in environments where reading is being supported. I remember with my kids, and I see now with my grandchildren, they're constantly, the parents are constantly asking the kids, what is this letter and how do you sound it out? And so what would this word be? And, you're supporting the learning of reading, which is not to say they don't need good teaching in school, because they do. As I mentioned before, my own youngest daughter really wasn't getting what she needed from school. So there is the poverty issue. No question about it. There is a lack of modeling and all of that stuff. But I argue in this piece, and I think there's a lot of evidence at this point, that they're not being taught to read. The reason they're not reading is because they're not being taught to read. Well, the teachers may think they're teaching them to read, but they're not. There's been a ongoing reading war, the way people talk about it, between about just how to teach reading. And the people who have won, for the most part, in ed schools and teacher prep programs and stuff like that, are people who believe in either what's called whole language, but sometimes might just be referred to as balanced literacy, which encourages students to just be surrounded by literature. They put a lot of books in the classroom. They read to the kids a lot, all of which is great, but they don't actually tell them how to engage with a word. They don't tell them how to decode a word because they think that's boring, and that children will learn to read naturally if you put them in the right situation. That is, with a lot of books and a lot of words being spoken and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I was told, I think, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was told, I mean, I think maybe when I was talking to Deb Philman, she was saying that they're not really doing phonics anymore.
No. Oh, they haven't for years, at least in many schools. And phonics, let me just clarify for your listeners. Phonics is when you look at a word and you break it down in, we have 26 letters in the alphabet, right? And there are about 44 sounds that come from their combination. And essentially what phonics does is teach kids how to recognize the letters for those sounds, so that they can tackle a new word and sound it out. That's what they mean by sounding it out, as opposed to sort of guessing. the real whole language stalwarts will say, well, we just want you to guess at the word. I mean, by the context, maybe you look at the first letter and sound that out, and then you guess. So if you have a word like pony, right? Instead of getting a child to look at n, right?
Mm-hmm.
And blend it, gradually blend it. You encourage the child to sort of guess by the context, by the illustrations, by the way the story is moving.
Okay.
And some kids do that pretty well, to be honest, but many don't. And it also doesn't help when really complicated words come up later. That you are just going to have to sound out. I still use it.
Yeah.
Sounding names, and that kind of thing. So we're not teaching that phonics, and we now have a significant number of linguists and psychologists and other neuroscientists who are studying reading and are saying, this is what works. You got to do the phonics. So I think there's a shift going on. There are states now that are insisting on reading science, on making sure teachers are using reading science.
Okay.
Many states, actually. Interestingly enough, one of the first or one of the most successful in that is Mississippi, which is not a state known for
Oh,
its
really?
great education system.
Yeah.
And is certainly known for a lot of poverty and a lot of Black poverty. But they had the largest jump in reading scores but this before the pandemic, and pandemic changes a lot, I admit. But before the pandemic, they had the biggest jump in reading scores among their young children of any state in the union. Now they're still only average, which is not great, but the point is it was doing something,
Yeah, and they're improving.
They're improving, and their kids are using this skill, which is really essential, I believe, to learning how to read.
It is. So it's almost like they're kind of going back a little bit and maybe having some newer stuff in there, but they're going kind of back to the basics of what I learned when I was in school about how to read,
Right. Well, I'm glad to hear you did, because many kids didn't.
Really? See, I was an 80s kid, so
yeah, the 80s is actually when we started to see more and more of the whole language. I know in New York.
I just dodged that bullet.
Yeah, you did. So I know in New York, where I live, in some of the more progressive neighborhoods, they've been doing this whole language for a long time. And I remember saying years ago, I don't think this is working for kids, for disadvantaged kids. And they didn't do a breakdown. In other words, they would test kids, but they wouldn't show us averages, or they didn't collect averages of kids from disadvantaged homes and kids from middle class homes, because I was pretty sure it wasn't working for the former.
Yeah, and you know what? Because my story is a little bit unique, and they may have been teaching it by the time I got into elementary school. But before second grade, my mom had me in a Montessori school, and that's where I learned to read. And I don't remember it very well because I was so little. But by the time I got into second grade, I was at like a fifth grade reading level. Because I would imagine that's because I do know that I did phonics and learned how to sound the words out. And by the time I got into elementary school, I knew how to take a word and break it down and be able to figure out how to spell it, how to say it, and even what it meant.
Well, that's so important. And they know at this point that how you're reading in third grade really predicts how you're going to go through school. I mean, it's very sad thing to say, but third grade reading scores are a very important predictor, or very significant predictor. I'm not saying that nobody gets beyond that, but
Sure.
It is on average a very useful predictor. And I mentioned in the piece that there are stories out there that state planners, prison planners, look at third grade reading scores to see what's coming down the pipe. I don't know whether that's true, but they
You
could do
mentioned,
worse. If
yeah,
you look at the
well, I was gonna say, even in your article, here's a quote: "If you want to make sense of racial gaps in high school achievement, college attendance, graduation, adult income, and even incarceration, you could do worse than look at third grade reading scores."
that's right. Yeah.
That blew my
Uh,
mind.
it's true though. And so, and there are a couple of complications in my good news story that you can actually do something about this. And I should mention that. One is there are kids who will learn will learn to read on almost any circumstances. We don't know why, they're just
Mhm.
kids for whom it clicks. So a lot of teachers hang on to that they do have successes to say that,
Mhm.
oh, it's working fine. When wasn't it under Bush that the No Child Left Behind insisted that localities use um, uh, test for different ethnicities and different subgroups to determine how kids were doing, and that's when I think we really started realizing, oh, we're doing a different job with white and black kids or white and minority kids. And I should mention Hispanic kids, they're a little better off than blacks, but not a whole lot. So
Not much.
and there are plenty of disadvantaged white kids, by the way, who are failing because of this approach, these erroneous approaches to teaching reading, as you might expect.
Well, yeah, I mean, because even with the numbers, yeah, white kids are doing better. I think by I think you said like 35%, but it's still not good. It's still not above 50% in some of
No,
these states.
no, right,
Yeah, it's still
right.
abysmal.
That's right. I mentioned the most successful state is Massachusetts. Why? Because they have 47% of their students reading proficiently.
Yeah, so it's less bad.
Yeah, right,
It's not
exactly.
good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mentioned before, I lost my train of thought, but one of the things about teaching phonics is that some teachers will say, well, I am teaching phonics, but it has to be done really carefully, really systematically from people who know how to do this, because it's very easy to drop in a little recognition of phonemic recognition, or one or two lessons now and again, and it's something else to really engage the system of phonics. There's a famous article on this that is entitled "Teaching Reading is Rocket Science." So it
I
you
bet.
really have, yeah, I thought that was cute. So it's not something that comes easily, and we do need good training on this, which will take time and money. Still, we're spending a lot of time and money on other things that I don't think are helping children nearly as much as good reading programs.
Yeah, I mean, and when I'm listening to you, I mean, it sounds like most of the problem is the way reading is being taught. But I'll throw this at you. Here's what I always hear from a certain group of people: it's the funding. These schools don't have enough money. We give them more and more money, but it's never enough. It's the funding, the funding, the funding. But I mean, and that's what accounts for the disparities in education. How much credence do you give to that? Because I'm sure it has some impact, but I'm a little skeptical. So I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, the state that gets, or the place that gets the most money in Michigan, Detroit,
Mm.
most education money per capita. So, I mean, that's just one example. Uh, it does require money to teach people for teacher training, but you don't have to have a swimming pool, or you don't have to have all kinds of extras that we think are essential for enrichment. If kids aren't reading, none of that matters. It doesn't
Mhm.
matter that they have a theater program or anything. They have to read, and so this has to be a top priority. And there is enough money at many of these schools, at almost all schools, to introduce new, better phonics training, better reading training. So I don't accept that, which is not to say that I don't think that there should be funding justice, to use a chic term, on this, because there should be. But I think it's a mistake to think there's something about the school, the money that the school is getting. There are many schools in places like China, Japan, where schools have far less bells and whistles, and those kids are doing great. So I think we
Yeah.
put.
Yeah, well, yeah, in bells and whistles, you just said, I think a lot of that money does go to bells and whistles. I mean,
Yeah.
I've seen some of these campuses; they're very nice, and nothing wrong with that. But especially in the case of Black children, which these people say they care about, I mean, that's the whole reason why they're pushing a lot of these concepts related to critical race theory. But you're right; what's the point of even doing that if they're not even going to be able to read it? Now, I will admit to having a tinfoil hat on this. And I do think that some of this is on purpose, because if you wanted to accept these precepts of critical race theory and other issues, it's kind of better that they don't know how to read. And because when you're a better reader, you're a better writer. You can, the reason I write so well is because I read well as a kid. I can think critically, but I think that they don't want that. But at the same time, it's like, and that's my little conspiracy theory. But what do you think? Why are they pushing these, like DEI and SEL, social emotional learning, when they can clearly see that these kids can't read at proficient levels? And we haven't even talked about math, but even in general, they're doing so poorly, and there is such a huge disparity. Why is their focus not on closing that disparity instead of trying to teach everybody about how everybody's racist?
Well, I think the instinct among a lot of educators and bureaucrats is to just not notice these kinds of gaps, because they're an embarrassment to the education profession, and they scare people. They scare people because does it say something about Black children that they're not learning? Which I don't believe. I think that if you teach them right, they'll learn.
Yeah.
So I think some of it is that. I think, educators are very, very prone to faddism. They love fads, like now it's DEI and SEL, and there's always these acronyms that they throw around. So I think some of it is that, but the anti-racism ideology has become so dominant in the schools that they really can't see anything else. So when you go, if you're an aspiring teacher and you go for an interview, what they're going to ask you at an elementary school, and this is poor schools, white middle class schools everywhere, is what have you done, or how does your teaching advance equity?
I've seen that.
And I wish one teacher would say, well, if they can read, they'll be much more equal. There won't
That's
be
the answer. That's the answer.
But they don't, because they're all under the influence of their peer group, of the ed establishment, which is so married to these ideas. And it's very, very hard to break through.
Yeah, there's so much here. I know we're living on time, so hopefully we can have this conversation again, because I think, especially when your article comes out, it's going to engender a lot of discussion, and this is a very deep issue. But last question, what do you see? Because you mentioned earlier that some schools are kind of starting to go back to what they know works. Do you, at least in Mississippi, do you think that this might become more widespread? Because he did mention the whole fad thing, which I have noticed just from talking to educators. It does seem like they jump on a lot of fads. Do you think that maybe kind of going back to some of what they know works might become a fad, hopefully?
It's not sexy enough. I'm not sure. Actually, you know what they call phonic teaching? Drill and kill. They
Oh,
see it as
come
boring.
on.
They see it as uncreative, and teachers want nothing more than to have creative children who are inventing, on their own, innovating in their own way and being little inventors and creators. I remember when my younger daughter was in school, they used to have writing workshops. This was in second grade. And each child was an author, right? And so they would read or they would keep their notebooks. And the teachers would say, okay, authors, show me your book work. And I mean, you could say, well, that's cute. That's okay. But
Yeah.
but it's not the point. They're not authors. They can't be at second.
You got to learn how to read first.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it's treating the child as more competent and grown up than they are, which I think is something we notice a lot among educators. And I gave examples. I'll give another plug for my article. I give two examples from the social justice movement of curriculum ideas, and they're so far advanced for what a child could understand, but they don't care because it makes the point that they want to make, and that's number one priority right now.
Well, yeah, that's sad. I mean, they're failing our children, and they're continuing to fail. But hopefully something will come out of this. So hopefully we will get a return back to that. If we can make phonics sexy again, I don't know.
Listen, I will leave you on a bright note. It isn't just Mississippi. There are a number of states that are moving into this. Now, it's interesting that this is happening at the same time that the anti-CRT movement is going on. Because it's as if the legislators are going, wait a minute, they're not doing their job and really noticing that. And somehow they're reading science. It's not a phrase that I love, but the reading science experts are getting to them and saying, you got to change this. And people are listening. So you've got Colorado is working on this. Now in New York City, I'm happy to say we have a new chancellor. First thing he said is, we're going back to phonics.
Nice.
Now,
good.
Let's see. Okay, so I'll leave you with that up note.
That works. We can pick up where we left off there. Maybe we can have you on again. But yeah, that's good. I'm glad to hear that. But before we sign off, why don't you let everybody know where they can find you?
Well, I'm at on Twitter at Kay Hymowitz, KayHymowitz. And you can also find me through the city-journal.org website.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for joining the program.
Well, this was a lot of fun. Thanks.
Thank you.